as week two of college football wraps up, we're going to take a look back at what was week two, the games that we saw, some exciting things. We learned a lot about a few teams, and we saw that some other teams have a few things to figure out. And week one gave us some things to realize and to kind of nibble on, but then week two obviously presents a new set of data points that give us a little bit different information. And that could not be more true for the first two teams that we'll talk about today. Colorado obviously found a way to win the football game, but it was not as pretty as it was last week against TCU. Nebraska gave them a little bit more trouble than maybe they wanted, but they still found a way to pull out a win. They found a way to capitalize on Nebraska's mistakes, and they found a way again to come out with a 36-14 win. So Colorado still showed plenty of signs of their strengths, but they also showed that there's still some things they need to improve upon if they want to be a national contender, which this point, you can't really say if they're going to be, but the signs are there. If they end up being a contender in this conference, we'll look back at their strong start and say this is exactly why. The first thing you have to note for either side is the turnovers, the mistakes by Nebraska, and mostly on Jeff Sims. You hate to put it on one player, but the three missed snaps, the turnovers, and just the inability to take care of the football probably is what did it in for Nebraska. Colorado really did well when they were able to capitalize upon that. And when you're in a game that's close, you simply cannot afford to turn the ball over, and you cannot afford to make those mistakes. And Nebraska did that. They kind of wasted a strong defensive performance because when you look at what they were able to do, so we talked about Colorado last week and their offensive line play, and I think that their offensive line play was better. Now, it's not good, it's not great, but it's definitely better. There are times where this group is really good, and I think that pass pro is where they're really strong at times, but also there's plenty to improve upon. However, when you have a quarterback like Shedeur Sanders, we'll talk about him more in a little bit, but when you have that guy who can escape pressure, who can extend plays, that's when you get extra yards. That's when you get extra time. And maybe your offensive line looks better. But this offensive line play definitely was better despite the 8 sacks they gave up. And that's where you have to tip your cap to Nebraska's defense. This was a unit that was put in poor situations time and time again against Colorado, and they did the best they could. There were times where Colorado made it look easy, but there were also times where Nebraska stepped up and made plays. They were very physical. And this was a chippy game. There was a lot of trash talking going on. There were penalties called for unsportsmanlike conduct. These were two teams that do not like each other, and these were two teams that were giving it everything they had to make sure that their team came out on top. And Nebraska's defense, despite being put in poor positions and almost every single drive, they responded the way you should for that unit. And this unit won't get as much attention as they deserve this year, but this is a unit that is a solid unit. They played well the last 2 weeks, and eventually you're going to cave. Like at a certain point, when your offense just isn't doing what it needs to do, then you eventually will cave. You can only handle so much, especially for this Nebraska team. And really, a lot of that goes to the offensive staff. But we'll talk about that more when we get into Sims. Shadeur's magic was once again on full display. We talk about how good Caleb Williams is at escaping pressure and extending plays, but Shedeur Sanders rivals that ability. We saw him make a number of plays this week by simply not getting sacked. There were times where, yes, this offensive line, they gave up 8 sacks, but it could have been double digits. That's how good Nebraska played in terms of getting after the quarterback. There were just times where Shedeur was just the better player. And his ability to extend plays was a big reason this team thrived offensively. He's threw for 393 yards, and now his 2 week total is the fourth most in Pac 12 history in the last 20 years. He is a phenomenal player. He is obviously one of the hottest players in college football right now. He is so fun to watch. He makes this team better. This offense is better because of his ability to extend plays, his ability to make big time throws. And that's really where this team steps up. And even when they're struggling, the best thing they did today was stack plays when they needed to, stack positive plays on top of each other. They didn't always do that. This was definitely a struggle for a while, but they found ways to stack good plays after good plays. And that was coming after mostly the turnovers that they saw from Nebraska, and they were able to capitalize on that. They took that turnover. I think the first touchdown was a perfect example of that. They create a turnover. Really, Jeff Sims just drops the ball, but they take that, and the next play, they throw it for a touchdown. So they were able to stack plays, and that's really what helped them take advantage of this game. They were able to take a step forward because they were able to stack those plays. And like I said, it's really a result of the talent that they've brought in. And yes, we had some questions about that coming in, but we also know that this is a super talented team and a group that we saw different players step up today. It wasn't the same guys that we saw in week one. We saw other players step. Xavier Weaver was a perfect example of that. But there are other players that stepped up. And the quarterback situation for Colorado is pretty much the same thing. Now, Shedeur did not break his own record, but he still threw for 393 yards. He also completed 31 of his 42 passes. So the efficiency is still there. You'd still have to tip your cap to Sean Lewis, because if Sean Lewis doesn't call the plays that he's calling, Shedeur is probably fine, but he deserves plenty of that respect and plenty of that love, because he's a phenomenal play caller who did a great job of helping this team capitalize on the turnovers that were created by their defense, and they turned that into points. And sure, obviously won the quarterback battle today. There's no doubt about that. There's no debate. This was an easy game for him in terms of production and beating out his opponent. Jeff Sims simply just did not have it. There were times where I thought Jeff Sims could make some really good plays. Now, in his defense, there were also times where he did not get much time to throw, but it was just kind of right back to his Georgia Tech days where you're just making poor decisions because you don't trust your team. Now, I will say the offensive staff is not good at Nebraska. Hiring Marcus Satterfield was not the right choice, in my opinion. Matt Rule just, I don't know. You can't just fire him after 2 games, but it's obvious that this wasn't the right choice. Jeff Sims is not being put in good situations. There's a play calling at times is not good as well, but obviously in the end, you have to have your quarterback step up. And now the question is Jeff Sims' time at Nebraska over? Like, are they going to move on from him? Because it was not good today. The procedural stuff, that snaps, you have to figure that out. You're an experienced quarterback. Yes, you're in a new system, but you're an experienced quarterback that should know how to time up some of those things, and you should be able to catch a snap. The 3 of the snaps we're talking about are all on Jeff Sims. Now, once you get past that, that's when you go to the offensive staff. But the turnovers simply didn't help. The turnovers were just brutal to watch. The turnovers are essentially what kept, I guess it really gave Colorado the lead. If this offense was even average, Nebraska probably has the lead going into halftime. Colorado obviously took advantage of that, and as they should have. But if Nebraska doesn't just shoot themselves in the foot, then I think you're looking at a Nebraska team that's closer at halftime or maybe even leading, because you pretty much just gave Colorado points. And that's on the offense. That's on the quarterback. And it's disappointing to see a guy that's so talented like Jeff Sims not work out and his new team not be able to help him in a way that elevates his game and makes him more consistent. Because right now, the issues that he's having are just not acceptable. And Colorado, you have to give them credit. They took advantage of that. And like I said before, it wasn't the same cast of characters for the most part that were absolutely dominant. I mean, you didn't see Dylan Edwards didn't have a great game. And then you look at Travis Hunter. Travis Hunter wasn't in the spotlight that much. They still talked about him quite a bit, but he didn't have the game that he had in week one. And that's to be expected. He's not going to have a great game every single game. Now, Shedeur still had a good game, so that's still the same. But Xavier Weaver had 170 yards and 1 touchdown. He was phenomenal for Colorado's offense. And there's so many playmakers that we could talk about. The one thing I think I have the biggest concern with his offense is their inability to run the football efficiently. Nebraska held them to just 58 yards rushing, and that's not going to get the job done against the Pac-12. Yes, you could probably throw the ball as much as you want, but in the end, you will have to run the ball at some point. The defense wasn't the best, but they were definitely better than they were last week. And I think that they created the turnovers, like we mentioned. They were able to get the ball back to their offense. And in the end, that's really all you can ask for. Last week, I talked about how this group can just be opportunistic, take care of the football on offense. And then the defense essentially just creates some turnovers, even if they're giving up yards and points. Now, they did a great job of keeping Nebraska off the scoreboard and creating turnovers. So that was definitely something that helped quite a bit. And then we talked about Nebraska. It's a very frustrating time to be a Nebraska football fan. And I can see why people might think that Matt Rule isn't the answer. And I understand the frustration. I understand why you think that, but you have to give it time. And I know that's frustrating to hear. And that's, I don't know, it's frustrating to see the same issues arise week after week with obviously changes we made. There, Matt Rule has a good history of turning things around. So it's just a matter of time. His defense is good. We have to give the credit to the defense. They played their tails off. They were able to create some turnovers, and they were able to create some not turnovers. They were able to create some big plays, some disruptive plays, and that really helped them quite a bit. And it wasn't enough, obviously. The defense can only do so much. And the tough part is that if the offense doesn't figure anything out, then Nebraska is probably going to struggle defensively because they're just going to wear out their playmakers, and it's not going to be a good time for anybody involved. So another good win for Colorado, building upon that momentum from week one. Nebraska once again back to the drawing board. Other early morning matchups that we'll talk about here. Georgia kind of got off to a slow start against Ball State until a punt return touchdown got things going. They win 45-3. Marvin Harrison Jr. reminded us that he's still a baller, so that was really fun to watch. Ohio State, maybe not the most dominant win that you would expect, but it was still fun to see their big time playmaker do a lot of good things. Penn State took care of business, just crushed Delaware. The rushing attack was phenomenal, 63-7 there. I think one of the underrated games, and I think most of the people kind of forgot about it because of the weather delay. Notre Dame beating NC State 45-24. I think that was a good win for Notre Dame to go on the road and be able to pull out that win. Audric Estime had a big game, 134 yards and 2 touchdowns. Another player that had a big game was Utah safety Cole Bishop. This was a game which Baylor probably should have won. They were up 13-6 for a long time. And then at the end of the game, they kind of just crumbled. And Cole Bishop made a number of big plays throughout the game. He had a big time interception that led to the go ahead touchdown to help them win 20-13. And then obviously the controversy was the missed pass interference call. We can debate about that all day, but this is still a frustrating time for Baylor. But Utah found a way to win. And once again, without Cam Rising, I don't know how much of a difference Cam Rising makes in this game, but I think that their offense would look at least a little bit more in tune and a little bit more a well-oiled machine. James Madison started off the game strong against Virginia. Virginia then stormed back to take the lead, but in the end, the Dukes pull off a 36-35 upset on the road. I think James Madison is a team on a mission, and the Sun Belt is really fun to watch this year. James Madison is one of those teams that Jordan McLeod appears to be the real deal. I think that he'll be a really fun player to watch. The defense is a legit defense, a legit top 25 defense. They will be disruptive. They will make a number of plays, and that's really what helped them win 36-35. Clemson struggled early on against Charleston Southern, which was very concerning, but they figured it out, obviously, and they found a way to win 66-17. The afternoon slate was pretty entertaining. The big one, obviously, was Texas A&M and Miami. Two teams that were looking to bounce back after 5-7 seasons, two teams that hoped that their offenses would take steps forward. And we saw that today. We saw these offenses create big plays. They look drastically different than the last time they played, which was last year. And the result was kind of surprising in a way. I don't think anybody expected Miami to run away with this one with a double-digit win. Maybe not run away, but definitely was in control for a lot of the game and definitely felt like they were the better team for most of that contest. We start with, I think that the slow start for Miami is what probably concerned a lot of people. You had a 3-and-out, you had a blocked kick, you had a muffed punt. there were a lot of things that weren't going Miami's way, and it kind of felt like here we go again, kind of one of those things. But they found a way to get things going and figure things out. And you kind of have to look at the offense and what they were able to do, and we'll start there. The first thing we have to talk about is Shannon Dawson's arrival and the masterpiece that was his play calling on Saturday. You look at what Tyler Van Dyke was able to do, and a lot of that can be attributed to Shannon Dawson. And one of the concerns I had about Shannon Dawson was he comes from Dana Holgerson's system where in his last two stops with Dana Holgerson, they had success. When he's ventured out on his own, it hasn't been as great. But this clearly was a great start to his time with Miami. I think so far we've seen a lot of good things. And the one thing we've talked about with Miami is how do you get Tyler Van Dyke back to his NFL draft, one of the top prospects form? How do you get him back to that? And we saw that today 374 yards and 5 touchdowns. I do think that even on some of these throws, he can still get better because there were times where he threw a deep ball and he looked kind of tentative, almost hesitant to make that throw, didn't get everything into it that maybe he could have. And that's only going to get better with the trust in his receivers, the trust in his play caller. That will get better. And that's really exciting if you're a Miami fan. I think that this is a team that has a ton of potential in an ACC that appears to be wide open with some of the teams we talked about. We already talked about Clemson. They don't exactly look like the Clemson of old. So that's something to keep an eye on. Miami is obviously one of those teams looking to get back to the top of the ACC. Won't be easy still, even with Clemson's struggles, but that's definitely something they're reaching for in 2023. And so far, they're off to a great start. For the Texas A&M, the offense, I think it did a lot better, but it is the defense that really let them down. Giving up 48 points and 374 yards through the air is not what we expected. I think a lot of people, including myself, thought this defense could be one of the best units in college football, and that just simply wasn't the case. Poor tackling was probably the biggest issue with this Aggies defense. I think there were a number of times where they could have, yeah, they gave up a big chunk of yards, but they made it worse by trying to shoulder tackle, not wrapping up, and just poor discipline when it came to ending the play. And that's what allowed Miami to get a lot of extra yards after the catch. I think that was something that killed Texas A&M at the worst times. I think that you're looking at a team that needs to do better, and especially with this offense, because let's talk about the offense. The offense looked good at times. I think that some of the turnovers were obviously bad, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the Aggies offense looks like it's a Bobby Petrino offense and not a Jimbo Fisher offense. And that's good. But if the defense doesn't do its part, it doesn't really matter. You're still looking at a team that is struggling on one side of the ball versus the other. And for once, it feels like it's the offense that's thriving, but the defense isn't doing its part. Now, there are some things that they still need to work on. I think Connor Wegman had a good game overall. Yeah, there were turnovers, and I get that. But I think the first interception isn't his fault. It was not his fault. The second one, yeah, you can blame it on him. It was at the end of the game where you have to throw. Miami knows that you're throwing. I don't know. At that point, I don't really care to debate that. The turnovers obviously didn't help, but one of them's not really on Wegman. You can't really do anything about that. But the turnovers really killed them in the end. That's really what hurt them a lot. But I think you look at what this team did, you have a lot of exciting players. Evan Stewart obviously showed out again. I think Ruben Owens could be a star. He had a great game. I think that the fact that this offense looks light years ahead of what it was last year says a lot about where this team is headed. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on going forward. We talked about Connor Wegman, 31 of 53. Maybe you want him to be a little bit more efficient, but I think that he was decisive. I think he made a lot of good reads, a lot of good decisions. And like I said, the two turnovers we talked about already, but 336 yards and 2 touchdowns. I think that he is obviously still getting settled into this new system, and I think he'll be just fine. He'll be a fun player to watch through obviously his first interception of his collegiate career, bounced back from that pretty well in the next drive. So that's something that I kept an eye on. How do you respond to something like that? And then just simply, he just got beat by a better player today. Tyler Van Dyke was phenomenal. 21 of 30, 374 yards and 5 touchdowns. Van Dyke looked like that potential top 10 pick that we used to know a couple years ago. And there's still some work that needs to be done to get back to that, but you saw the confidence of the guy that he used to be. And that's what we really need to see for Miami to be better. This offense has plenty of players that can take a step forward and help out. And offense and defense did their part today. We're looking at Tyler Van Dyke was obviously the first one to do that, but the wide receivers were incredible. And I think everybody had their eyes on Colby Young, but two other guys really stepped up. Xavier Restrepo finally became the player that everyone expected him to be. For a couple years now, we wanted him to be this dominant slot player that was super explosive, and that the team just didn't really allow him to do that. The system just wasn't what he wanted, or he just wasn't playing his potential. We finally saw that. 6 catches for 126 yards. He was making Texas A&M's life miserable, and he was just one of the players that was doing it. Now, Kobe Young had a decent game, but it was not the best game of the best wide receivers here. Jacoby George had a phenomenal game, 5 catches, 94 yards, 3 touchdowns. He was also one of the players that had a catch that was going for 20, 25 yards. Texas A&M decides not to wrap up, and all of a sudden he's running for another 30 yards for a touchdown. He was a bright spot for this team, and I think that for the first time in a long time, you can say the wide receivers are an asset. You can say the wide receivers are a strength of this offense. So that's really exciting if you're a Miami fan. That's really exciting for Shannon Dawson. That's really exciting for Tyler Van Dyke. And the Hurricanes are really in need of that. I think the rushing attack was, if you want to point something out as technically a weakness, they're maybe just not as good as the passing attack today. However, Henry Parrish looks like he might be in the best shape of his life. He is the most explosive I've seen him, and he was making some big plays, and they have depth at that position too. The defense, maybe not the best performance, but still made a number of plays. Cameron Kinchins, hopefully he's okay. I haven't looked for an update yet on his status going forward, but I hope that he's okay. I hope his injury is not too serious. He had a good game, added another interception to his resume. I think this defense played super physical. Definitely a lot of trash talk going on. This was a confident group, a group that made life miserable for Texas A&M at times. But I think that this is a group that also can improve a little bit, get a little bit better, and that makes this team better as a whole too. Evan Stewart, we already talked about him for Texas A&M. I think there were a couple guys that stood out. Stewart is one of them. Ruben Owens, we already talked about. We talked about Connor Wegman. There were guys that stood out on both sides, and Texas A&M just has to figure something out on defense because there's too much talent on this defense for that to happen. There's too much talent on this roster for that to happen. And Miami obviously took care of business. They had a ton of recruits at the game, and that was another win for them. And now it's just a matter of figuring out how to build them on that momentum. Texas A&M has to figure out what do they need to do to figure things out defensively. How do they fix things? Because it looks like they've got some things figured out offensively, but for the defense to take a step back is disappointing. But huge win for Miami. I think there's a lot of good things for Miami to work with. I think there's also a lot of good things for Texas A&M to work with. So I think it's just a matter of figuring out what works, what do you need to fix, fixing those things that didn't go right, and finding ways to build upon the things that did. Other afternoon slots, you look at Michigan's cakewalk. Again, I don't think they really are hurting without Jim Harbaugh. The first 3 games are an easy schedule. There's not too many things that they have to be worried about, and they took care of business against UNLV. JJ McCarthy with another solid day against an inferior opponent. So don't take too much weight into that, but still a good game. Took care of business and did what they needed to do. Tulane had some rough news before the Ole Miss game. Michael Pratt would not play because of a knee injury. They still kept things interesting. I think the final score doesn't do the game justice. 37-20 was not the distance that it felt between these two. I mean, for a lot of the game, Tulane was actually up on Ole Miss, at least for a lot of the first half. They were taking care of business. They were taking it to Ole Miss until Ole Miss found a way to pull it out in the end. I think that Jackson Dart played really well down the stretch. That was really exciting to see if you're an Ole Miss fan. I think that he is the biggest X factor for that team. And then after that is you have so many playmakers that you can utilize. And he made a number of good throws today, but you do have to tip your cap to Tulane. That defense is much better than people expect. The offense has some playmakers that obviously can get things done. We'll see what Michael Pratt's status is going forward, because if he's not going to play, that's a big loss for them. That's a drastic drop off. But I think Kyle Horton did a good job. It's just that he's not Michael Pratt, and you have to wonder, maybe Pratt makes this game closer, or maybe Tulane even wins this game. So that was really tough, but still a good game for Tulane. I'm sure it was huge for that program to have Ole Miss come to town. It was a packed stadium, and for a while this game was interesting. And again, the score doesn't indicate how close this game actually was, but still an entertaining game, even without one of the top playmakers for both sides. Iowa took care of business 20-13 against Iowa State. They're not really doing themselves any favors in terms of getting the jokes away from Brian Ferentz. So I mean, it is what it is at this point. Iowa just continues to do what it needs to do, win football games. So that is what it is. Sticking in the Big Ten, Northwestern came into this game against UTEP as a 1.5 point underdog, and they took that disrespect and turned it into a 38-7 win. That was really interesting to see. The fact that they were an underdog was interesting for bettors. I'm sure some people made quite a bit of money on that game, but that was a good performance for them. Northern Illinois beat Boston College last week, and then they proceeded to lose to Southern Illinois this week. So that was a head scratcher. Toledo lost to Illinois last week on a last second field goal, but they appear to be a team on a mission. They won 71-3 against Texas Southern, which you shouldn't take too much weight into, but they also didn't do that last year. And maybe Taquan Finn is more experienced and he is more comfortable as a quarterback, but definitely keep an eye out for Toledo going forward. Marshall had a statement win against ECU. ECU is kind of raveling right now. Rasheen Ali had another big game, 85 yards and 3 touchdowns. Again, 31-13 for Marshall against an AAC team. That's huge for the Sun Belt. Sun Belt had a pretty strong showing in week 2 as well. Tennessee for a while was playing around with Austin Peay and finally pulled it out with a 30-13 win. They finally figured out what they needed to do to be successful. And yeah, there were some games that were a lot closer than people expected. North Carolina was another one. North Carolina just can't beat Appalachian State by more than a touchdown. They just have to make things interesting. 40-34 in double overtime. It's hard because yes, you don't want to overreact in week 1. It's really hard not to. So you just try to look at observations. And it looked like North Carolina had a defense that could be disruptive, that could be a playmaker, a difference maker for this team. And then obviously the offense needed to figure things out. But you give up 30 points, the 34 points to Appalachian State, and that just tells you that, well, maybe you're not that team. And obviously, you don't want to overreact in week 1. You also don't want to overreact the other way in week 2. So that was tough. Is frustrating if you're a North Carolina fan, but at least you start the year 2-0 instead of 1-1. The night slate had some interesting games as well. I think the biggest one, for the ones that we're not going to go in depth, was Cincinnati surprising us by beating Pitt 27-21. I think that was a game that most people expected Pitt to win, but Cincinnati obviously took care of business. And, for a while they were up by a lot. It had to come back late, and Cincinnati held them off. So another good win for Scott Satterfield and that team. Missouri struggled to beat Middle Tennessee, and Miami knows all about that. But at least they won that game. But Middle Tennessee, I think, is going to be tough in Conference USA this year. So that will be a team to keep an eye on. Memphis didn't have any problem beating Arkansas State. Washington State, a big one here, beat Wisconsin, jumped out to a big lead. I believe it was 24-6. And Wisconsin stormed back a little bit to make it 24-22, but Washington State held on to win that game. And we kind of knew that. I think that Wisconsin still has some of those old players that are still getting used to the new system, getting used to the new culture. So that probably played a role. We saw a little bit of Phil Longo's magic, his influence on that offense, and that obviously helped them quite a bit and help them get back in the game. But there's obviously still plenty of work to do. Cam Ward, if you haven't watched Cam Ward, go watch him. He's so much fun to watch. And that offense has a number of playmakers that, I mean, they have things to work on, but if they put it all together, this is a really fun team to watch in a loaded conference. Mississippi State won 31-24 in overtime. Daniel Laura, if he doesn't throw 3 picks in the first half, Arizona probably wins this game. And we talked about Jaden Laura coming in and how he needed to work on his interceptions. Last year, he was in double digits, on his way to doing that once again. That's going to be a killer for this Arizona team, and it's really going to limit what they can do offensively. Now we get into the rest of the night slate, the big ones for the night slate, and we talk about someone who I want to know what you guys think in terms of could we see someone get fired. Houston lost to Rice tonight, and good for Rice. That is a huge win for that program. Houston has taken care of business for the most part in that game for a while now, and for them to win that game with JT Daniels, Luke McCaffrey had an insane catch, and that was really fun to watch. But if you're Houston, do you fire Dana Holgerson? Now, obviously, money is probably the biggest concern there. The buyout will be the main thing that people want to know about. But if you're getting Big 12 money, do you not worry about that? You just use it. This is year five of Dan Holgerson. And yes, there have been some weird things. You had the COVID year, you had year one where you're quote unquote tanking and trying to figure that out. But you're now 28 and 20 in your fifth year at Houston. This isn't like Tulsa or Navy or someone else that's not in the area that you are. You're at Houston. Houston, one of the best areas for recruiting in terms of finding talent and getting players to commit to your school that can make a difference and help you compete against Power Five competition. There's a reason why Houston wanted to be at the Power Five, is because they believed that they could get the talent in their area, in on their home turf, to come to their program so that they can compete with Power Five teams. And now you're losing to Rice. In fact, Dana's last 3 losses are to Rice, Tulsa, and to SMU in embarrassing fashion. Now, yes, you are going to give up a lot of points when you play the style of offense that Dana wants to play. But that SMU game was awful. And not all of that is on Dana. I get that. But it's on Dana to stop that. And you just lost to Rice in year five. It's not like this is your first year and you're dealing with, like, these are all your guys now. There is nobody there from the previous regime that is making a big impact. These are your guys. So you haven't recruited well enough to beat Rice. I just it blows my mind how, if there's not a move made, how that's acceptable. And I'm sure they're going to say no, it's not acceptable regardless of what they decide. But in no way should Houston ever lose to Rice. Ever. Especially now that you're in the Big 12. You're going to the Big 12 because you believe you have the talent and the facilities and everything to compete with the best of the best. And now you're losing to a team that went 5-7 in Conference USA last year. Conference USA, you can make an argument, was the worst conference in college football last year. And you're losing to a team that has a losing record in 2022 in year five. I don't know. And you look at even last year, 2 years ago, Houston goes to the AAC championship game, loses to Cincinnati. Now, you can make an argument that you should not have inferior talent to Cincinnati. But then at the same time, Dana's probably building his program. We go through that rebuilds, the tanking season, and you're 2 years away from that. And sure, you know what? Maybe it was a surprise to get there. But you can make an argument that you should not be that much inferior to a Cincinnati team like that. But that's not the biggest problem. You go 12-2, you make it to the AAC championship game. You then, the next year, with most or almost all of that same talent that brought you to the AAC championship game and helped you win 12 games, and you go 8-5. And then the worst part is, after that season, you basically blame everybody else for saying that your team should have made it to the AAC championship game. Why did you not expect to go to the AAC championship game? Why was that not the goal? Why is that not the expectation? It's not like you lost a lot of talent. It's not like you had a bunch of injuries. You had almost the exact same roster, the exact same two deep, and you went 8-5 with losses, with a loss to Tulsa. The amount of talent that Tulsa gets compared to the amount of talent that Houston gets, period. Even with underachieving recruiting, if you ask a lot of people, that should be enough to win that game. Tulsa does not get the same athletes that Houston does. Tulsa does not have the same access to the athletes that Houston does. Houston is literally in a hotbed of recruiting. If the best recruits in Houston stayed at Houston, they would be one of the best programs in college football. Now, yes, they were in the AAC, so some guys aren't going to come to Houston because they don't want to go to a Group of 5 program, which is a whole nother debate. But you have this amount of talent and you're losing to teams that either don't have the same access or playing an inferior conference and have inferior talent. Now, yes, you can make an argument that there are some players on Rice right now that are better than what Houston has at their positions. But that's also a problem. Houston should never have that issue. Transfer portal obviously makes it different, but it just doesn't make any sense. You're in year 5 and you're this is just, if you're a Houston fan, I don't know how any Houston fan isn't sick of this. And obviously the money part is probably the biggest thing there, but like the results just aren't doing it. And this is week 2 of year 5 and you're losing to Rice. And I hate saying this about Rice because I don't want to take away from that win for them, but if you look at it objectively, in no universe should Houston lose to Rice ever. The fact that they were down 28-7 was embarrassing. That shouldn't happen. So I don't know what this organization above him is going to do, what this school is going to do, but you have to sit down and have a serious talk. And maybe Dana doesn't care because clearly you don't care if your team went to the AAC championship and you didn't make it back there with the exact same team. So maybe Dana doesn't care. But at this point, you have to look at, should we move on? And obviously there's certain parts of this program that are good, but and there's other parts of this coaching staff that deserve blame. I mean, Doug Belk's probably up high on that list, but there's certain coaches that don't really have anything to do with the struggles. So I don't know. I'm curious to hear what everybody thinks. Should they move on from Dana? Is it time? I don't know. I don't know what to do. I just don't have any good answers for why this is happening. I don't have any good answers for why Houston's underachieving because with Tom Herman, things were great. The hype was real. They were playing against really good teams. They were competing for conference championships. They were competing for New Year's Six bowl bids. And now it feels like Houston's further from that than they've ever been. And that maybe even includes Major Applewhite era. And that was horrible. So I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Should Dana be gone? Is it time to move on? What should we look at? If you're optimistic, what are you looking at for the future that you like? And if for those who don't like it, let me know what you don't like. It's good win for Rice, good for them. Mike Bloomgren does a phenomenal job of building this program, of helping them elevate their game and overachieve. And this was a huge win for that program. And maybe it elevates them in the AAC to compete and even make a bowl game. And I hope that that happens because I really like where he's going. I hope JT Daniels has a good season. I hope Luke McCaffrey has a good season. It was a good win for them. And maybe this is the game that sends Dana packing for once. Texas and Alabama obviously was the highlight of this week. We all knew that this was the week 2 matchup to watch. And honestly, it did not disappoint. Texas and Alabama both displayed some really exciting things, and there are obviously other things they need to work on. And we'll dive into that today. We will dive into what went right, what went wrong for each program, and how do they fix that? How do they build upon certain things, and how do they go back to the drawing board, watch the film, and fix things in practice? But Texas obviously took care of business. They were really fun to watch, and Quinn Ewers had a big game. I think that the receivers that we've been talking about for a while had a big game as well. And so now we will dive into what went well, what needs to improve. And we start with the play calling for Steve Sarkisian. Steve Sarkisian in big games is a phenomenal play caller. He does not buy into the spotlight. He is not caught up in the hype. He is not caught up in the attention, the stress, any of that stuff. He simply wants to make the best play call possible. And there were a number of plays, even the incompletions or the missed opportunities that Texas had. There were a lot of them where their guys wide open or would be headed for the end zone, and they just either missed the pass or Quinn Ewers didn't even look their way, something like that. There were certain plays where I think if you're going to look for something that Texas needs to improve upon, it's hitting more on those plays because they hit a bunch tonight. But this game could have been a blowout, honestly, if Texas was able to hit some of these plays. Texas did such a good job of play calling from Sark. That was a masterpiece of play calling because there were times where Alabama had nobody covered, and even look at the touchdowns. Some of the touchdowns, the last one to Adonai Mitchell, what a play call. And especially against Nick Saban in that defense, Kevin Steele and Nick Saban working together again to be able to do what they did against that defense is impressive. And Alabama's defense, despite this, I think they're going to be a really fun group to watch. I think that they have now seen what level it takes to win football games, and they were still giving Texas everything that they could. There were a number of big plays by this defense. There were a lot of physical hits. It was a really fun game to watch. And I don't really love, the traditional powerhouses all the time, but this game was super entertaining. This game was fun to watch. To be able to just sit back and watch two really good teams go against each other was entertaining. And yes, there were some mistakes made, and it's week two. We should expect that. But this was a really fun game to watch. Both sides provided us with plenty of entertainment, and it started with Texas, and we'll talk about those pass catchers. Coming into this year, we all expected Quinn Ewers to elevate his game, and a big reason for that was the guys that he was throwing to. Xavier Worthy was probably the top one, and once again, we saw some drop issues, but we also saw Xavier Worthy's potential and what he can do. He was heavily involved early in the game. They got him the football as much as they could, and he did some damage to this defense. You also saw Jatavian Sanders led the team in receiving. He was phenomenal. Adonai Mitchell had a couple of touchdowns. Jordan Whittington had a couple of big plays. There were a lot of guys that stepped up for Texas, and it was this hype that we came in with the pass catchers was almost justified tonight. We saw them step up in a big game and in a big way. And yes, you can say some of that was Steve Sarkisian, but you also have these playmakers that did their part too. So that was really fun to watch. And this game had the potential to be back and forth for the entire game. The biggest difference was the turnovers. Texas did not turn the ball over, and Alabama had those two interceptions. Um, that was the difference. A 34-24 win for Texas was because they took advantage of those and the turnovers were put them deep in Alabama territory, and they took advantage of that. So that was the biggest difference, which leads me to this last point. Jalen Milroe had a roller coaster of a game, and I don't think a quarterback change is necessary. However, I do think that he needs to watch the film and figure out how he can get better because there were times where it's like, okay, he can run, he's fast, but that's it. And then there were times where, he throws the pick in the second half and Texas goes down and scores. The next drive was just chaos. First, it was Jalen Milroe threw some really nice passes on that drive. Threw a number of passes, couple on the run, looked very confident, and even had to endure some bad snaps too. So he was the one thing that I'll give Jalen Milroe, and it's a big one for a lot of quarterbacks. And if you're looking for something that all quarterbacks could use, It's Jalen Milroe's confidence. This kid threw two interceptions, and the next pass that he threw, it's like he had never thrown an interception in his life. He threw that ball with the confidence that he has no, almost has, memory loss. He has no recollection of throwing that last pick. And I mean that in a good way. I mean that he did not think he's not tensing up, he's not second guessing his decision. He he was just throwing the ball like he knew exactly what he was doing, and then he didn't just make a big mistake earlier. And maybe that's what gets him in trouble, but I think that for a lot of quarterbacks, you would have seen a quarterback change because they would tense up, they would clutch up, and they would essentially be a worse quarterback because they're always thinking, well, I've made that mistake before. I can't make this throw because what if I throw another pick? Jalen Milroe does not play like that. Now, he does need to get more consistent as a passer. At times, he did not look comfortable, but you could also see the confidence in he wants to win so bad where he's just going to flush that interception. And now maybe you see him look at the film and figure out what went wrong. How do I not make that same mistake again? But that second half drive throws a pick. The next drive leads Alabama down, and it was a smooth drive. I thought, obviously, besides the missed snaps or the bad snaps, he made throws like he was having a career game. There were three throws, and the touchdown throw too was just on a line, super confident, like there was nothing to be worried about, and he made it with ease. So that's definitely something that Alabama can work on and can build upon. I don't think you make a quarterback change. I don't think you need it. I think that if you can harness what Jalen Milroe does well and find ways to eliminate the mistakes and maybe get him a little bit more comfy earlier, I think at the beginning of the game, he looked almost, yeah, uncomfortable, unsure of what he was doing. And getting him involved in the rushing attack early is kind of what helped him settle in. So maybe you get him involved early in the rushing attack again, and maybe I don't know, maybe you just throw some shorter passes early on. So I don't know what the solution is there. Obviously, there were times where he did not have time to throw. So there were a number of things that didn't go well for Alabama, and some of that is on Jalen Milroe, and some of that is on the rest of the team and the coaching staff. One of the things that did not go well was slowing down Quinn Ewers, and we all knew this was a big game for him. We all knew that he was looking to elevate his draft stock. He was looking to have a strong performance after getting knocked out of last year's game. And I said that if he has a big game, there's going to be a difference in this game. I think that Alabama fans still expected to win this game, and they did not expect anything from Quinn Ewers. There were people who also said that it didn't matter if Quinn Ewers would have played last year. Well, I hate to break it to you, but we saw tonight that it would have made a difference last year. Quinn Ewers at his peak can shred any defense. And this is an offense that is going to be a problem. And Alabama found out firsthand. Part of that is Steve Sarkisian's play calling, but Quinn Ewers also made a number of throws that torched this defense. And he threw it right where he needed it to. And obviously, there's still some overthrow issues, some drop issues for this team, but he still took care of business and he still sent a message that he's one of the best quarterbacks in college football. And that's terrifying for everyone that has to face Texas, but it's really terrifying for the Big 12. And Quinn Ewers obviously is just one of the players that teams will have to stop. But when you look at the pass catchers we talked about Jatavian Sanders, talked about Adonai Mitchell, Xavier Worthy, Jordan Whittington. We didn't even mention the rushing attack. When they needed the rushing attack to be good, Texas rushing attack was good. Jonathan Brooks was solid. CJ Baxter got a lot of attention early on. That was kind of surprising, but not unexpected. So that was something that will keep teams worried for a while. The offensive line did everything it could against that defensive front for Alabama, a group that is going to be very good this year. And I think Alabama's Alabama's defense won't get a ton of credit for what it did tonight, but I think at times this group was swarming. This group was disruptive. And that made Texas life difficult. That made Steve Sarkisian work for all that, the points he got, the yards he got. So I think Texas is obviously the winner here, but Alabama is still in good hands. I think that the offense has a quarterback that you have certain intangibles that you can't teach to other people, but you obviously, in terms of production, need him to settle down and make some better decisions. I don't think the world is ending for Alabama. It's disappointing, obviously, but you also just lost to a really good team. Texas is going to make a lot of teams look foolish, more foolish than they made Alabama look at times. So I don't think you have anything to hang your hat on if you're Alabama. And for Texas, you have a lot of reason to believe that you belong in the college football playoff and that the Big 12 is yours for the taking. Oregon found a way to survive in Texas Tech, and it was not unexpected. I think that when you score 81 points against an FCS team, you kind of expect that team to come down to earth. And then when you lose to your group of five team, you kind of expect them to be motivated to bounce back. And we saw exactly that. And it made for a really entertaining college football game. These are two teams that were fairly comparable in terms of total yards and whatnot. Biggest difference will be one thing that we'll talk about, as you can already see. And Oregon was kind of sloppy. I think the penalties were not great for this team. And I think that certain people had to step up in a big way. But in the end, they're still undefeated, and now they're back to the drawing board of how do we improve upon this. I think the first thing that stands out was the turnovers, because if Texas Tech does not turn the ball over four times, they probably win this football game. And it's tough if you're a Texas Tech fan. You have two heartbreak games in a row. You lose on the road to a group of five team in Wyoming, and then now you lose at home to Oregon, a team that you felt you had on the ropes. You were up 30 to 27 late, and then Oregon storms back and just finds a way to win the football game. And obviously that's heartbreaking. And I think that honestly, I think that's probably what hurts the most is that you were right there. You're right there to win these games, and then you just make some mental mistakes. For the Oregon side of things, at times Bo Nix was one of the few highlights they had. Bo Nix was leading this team, willing this team to win the football game. And they are very glad that he is back for another year. And he showcased why he is so valuable to this team. There were times where nobody's open. Bo Nix is running for it. There's times where he has no time to throw, but somehow finds his receiver downfield. Bo Nix was very impressive tonight. And I think he was the difference outside of the turnovers, probably between Oregon winning and losing, because it doesn't matter if you create turnovers if your offense doesn't do anything with it. And Bo Nix did a good job of keeping this team in the game. And it was a back and forth game for a while. Bo Nix was so much fun to watch. And again, a big reason why they won this game. And now you have to work with that. You have to figure out what went wrong. I think that the biggest thing is that even though Texas Tech turned the ball over so much, they responded almost to every turnover. I think there was one, I don't remember which one it was. It was either the second or third one, but Tyler Shuck throws an interception and he's trying to hit Jaron Bradley. And Bradley's obviously frustrated coming off the field. And Shuck basically just looks at him like, one, that's my bad. But two, we know how to beat that next time. And then the next drive, he hooks up with Bradley for a touchdown. I think on a similar play. So I think they did a good job of responding. It's just that you turn the ball over four times. You can't do that. You can't you can't do that against a top 25 team, a team that thinks they can play for a national championship. You just can't do that. You're not going to win football games turning the ball over four times. Penalties also didn't help. Now Oregon struggled with that more than Texas Tech, but added to the number of things that Texas Tech needed to fix in this game. Tyler Shuck, it was a tough game. I'm not gonna lie. It was a tough game for the former Oregon Duck, who is probably a little bit more motivated to win this one and just couldn't get the job done. I think that Bo Nix did a great job. I think that 359 yards and 2 touchdowns. Shuck had 383 total yards and 4 touchdowns, but biggest difference is the turnovers. Bo Nix took care of the football. Tyler Shuck did not. And that's honestly the difference. Is literally the difference in this game. And you can respond well, that's fine. But in the end, you have to limit your turnovers. And now you're looking at it. This is the Texas Tech team that a lot of people expected to have a breakthrough year, a breakout year, and compete for a Big 12 championship. And technically, yes, they can still do that. They're 0-2 in non-conference play, which does not affect their Big 12 play. But I would worry how much damage this did to this team's morale. I don't know how much they can bounce back after what was a very disappointing loss. And I don't know how you improve upon that because you're looking at 2 games now where you've had leads and the other team storms back and it feels like they stole it from you. So how do you fix that? How do you work with that? Joey McGuire obviously is tabbed with that responsibility, but this is a group that I think when you look back at it, 2 1-score losses should not deflate this program. 2 1-score losses should not ruin this morale so much that the season derails. But you do have to fix some things. And Oregon, obviously, I think if you're Oregon, you probably look at this as a wake-up call because the teams that you're going to face will be as explosive as Texas Tech, mainly Washington, USC, Washington State looks good today. Oregon State will give you troubles. There's a lot of teams that Oregon has to worry about. And maybe this is the wake up call that gets them going. But I do know that they're 2-0, which is better than how they'd feel if they were 1-1. And winning a football game like this gives you a chance to build character, to find ways to win football games. And now you get to go back to the film and see what do we need to do different to elevate our game where if we play a team that's just like this or better, we don't find ourselves in a tough situation. And the final game that we'll break down here was another back and forth game. Just maybe not as entertaining. UCF and Boise State was there were highlights, that's for sure, but yeah, a very boring game if you are a fan of offenses, maybe not offenses, because UCF had 530 yards of total offense. But if you're looking for a barn burner, this is not your game. And I think I think that's hard because 18-16 is so boring. And you obviously have to find ways to win, and that's what UCF did. But it's tough. And I think both teams feel like this game should have gone a little differently. And if you're UCF, we'll start with this. If you're UCF, I don't see how you can feel great about this win. No disrespect to Boise, but the fact that you struggled to put up 18 points says that you are in for a long season in the Big 12 because Boise State's defense is good. And honestly, if we'll give credit where credit's due, Boise State's defense was swarming and did everything they could to keep UCF off the scoreboard. And I think that this defense will be one of the best that UCF sees all year. However, they are not going to face an abysmal offense like Boise State's the rest of the year either. I think that Boise State has a lot of work to do offensively, and it starts with the quarterback position, but UCF is not going to see that level of struggle from another team the rest of the season. At least I don't think, especially not when you get to Big 12 play. So that's definitely something that they need to work on. If you're Boise State, you're 0-2 suddenly, and that's not what you expected. That is definitely not where you thought you'd be sitting after week 2. And the quarterback position we'll dive into later, but that is the position that is going to make or break your season. When you have a stud like Ashton Jeanty, who had another huge game, 212 yards and 1 touchdown, this kid is phenomenal. And if you have not watched Ashton Jeanty play football, you are missing out. He is so fun to watch. And I'm worried how they'll overuse him this year because of how much this offense has struggled. But worst case scenario is that he's really fun to watch and he gives you some entertainment. So there is something to be said about that. He was fun to watch. I would watch him every single week do what he did because he did that against Washington and now he did it again against UCF. So you should expect more of that the rest of the season. The one thing we talked about coming into this game was which quarterback could be more consistent. And the answer was neither. The answer was very disappointing. And quarterbacks combined threw one touchdown and three interceptions. And Taylor Green obviously goes out with an injury. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. So Madsen comes in and they looked a little bit better, but John Rice Plumlee was okay. I it feels like if Javon Baker and Kobe Hudson are two of the most misused or underutilized wide receivers in college football. And there were times where like Javon Baker made an incredible catch tonight. And it was just like just a reminder that this is not a pass friendly offense. This is not, I mean, when you can't, it's almost like when you can't throw the football, UCF's offense becomes pretty boring and pretty predictable. And then you have to almost continue throwing the ball because you have to find balance. And John Rice Plumlee just isn't going to be that quarterback for you. But also, I feel like the coaching staff also is very quick to kind of slow down and shy away from throwing kind of the deep ball. And I just, you're, I'd argue that two of UCF's best playmakers on offense are Hudson and Baker. It's just that you don't see the production for them because they're not in an offense that allows them to showcase their talent as much as you should. Now, Plumlee's explosive. He's not the greatest passer. I still think that he can be a lot better than he is. We've seen it before. It's just he doesn't do it as often. RJ Harvey is a really good running back. So the talent is there. And the reason why I say that this is not a great win for UCF is because you should have won this game by a lot more. Your defense did a lot to keep you in this game. And the fact that you had 530 yards of total offense and only put up 18 points is concerning going forward. You can't find a passing attack. This is this is a passing attack. Let's say this. This Boise State pass defense got shredded by Michael Penix for 450 yards and 5 touchdowns. John Rice Plumlee obviously is not Michael Penix, but there's clearly some weaknesses in this passing attack that you could have exploited, and they just didn't. So it's a solid win. You're beating a good team in Boise State, or maybe not good because they're on two, but a team that's a solid team, a tough team to beat. But you have to tip your hat, I guess, to Boise State to be able to bend but not break. The fact they gave up 530 yards and only 18 points says that they did what they could to keep their team in the game. And when you have a quarterback issue, now granted, losing Taylor Green to an injury obviously hurt. And it didn't feel like he was doing anything that was giving you consistency until Madsen came in. Then it felt like the offense had a chance to be explosive, but at that point it felt like too little too late. So we'll see what happens going forward. Is Green going to be the guy? What have we seen from Green that says maybe he should be the guy going forward? Do they have a quarterback controversy or a quarterback battle? We will see. Because when you look at the stats, nothing really stands out. Only was 16 to 24 for 272 yards, 0 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Green was 9 of 19. Another rough game for him. 144, 1-1. It's just not inspiring. It does not threaten any defense. It does not make any defense respect your passing attack. You have to find a way to push the ball downfield. And like I said, there's a lot of talent on both sides of these teams. You have talent at wide receiver that can be utilized. Or maybe Boise State just has to use Ashton Genty as much as possible, and maybe that's just their option. But for UCF, this is a UCF team that their fan base has been expecting big things from them since 2017. They have been expecting them to go into a Power Five conference and command attention and command respect. If you're only beating a Boise State team that struggles a lot by 2 points on a game-winning field goal, which shout out to Colton Boomer, dude. 4 of 4 on field goals, including the game winner. Good for you. You got to figure things out, though. This is, if you're a UCF, this should not be an acceptable result. It should not be what you expect from your team. And going forward, you have to figure things out. And maybe you can't make a quarterback change because there's not really a ton to warrant that, but there's clearly something that's lacking, and you have to figure that out. Now, the defense obviously did its part too. That's really exciting. I think that's going to help UCF when it gets into Big 12 play, and that was a good way to continue the success for week 2. So there are some good things. UCF did a lot of good things defensively. Kept Boise State off the board. Didn't have an answer for Ashton Genty, but they had an answer for everybody else. So one guy's probably not going to beat you by himself, especially in the game of football, but there are things that could get better. There are things that could improve for both sides, but UCF obviously comes away with a win. They are 2-0. Boise State needs to figure some things out. They are 0-2, but I think Boise State now is kind of entering that sleeper territory in the Mountain West. So don't sleep on them. They'll still be a tough team to beat. And it'll be interesting to see how both teams perform in week 3 and week 4. And then once you get the conference play, what do they look like there? Because this was a struggle of a game. It was disappointing for both sides. There were also a couple things you can build upon, but I think that this coaching staff will be looking, both coaching staffs will be looking at the film and thinking, how do we get better and how do we make sure that we don't struggle this much the rest of the season?